There we go. So in the book of Esther, again, we don't know the author. We think it probably was, or some people think it was Mordecai. It doesn't really matter. It's very difficult to figure out an Old Testament book like this as to who the author is if they're not identified, because we don't really know their writing styles. It's not like Paul in the New Testament or Peter or John, who have written several things, and you can identify their writing style somewhat. It's not like that. We just have this book in the middle of our Old Testament. Again, it's almost written like a play, and it's read every year by faithful Jews, even to this day. So they have a feast that they call Purim, Purim. It's a feast of lots, casting lots. It's kind of nicknamed after that. And during the Feast of Purim, they read the entire book of Esther, which, is really great, because even our author mentions that there are other uninspired books that mention the book of Esther or the story of Esther, and they add to it. She mentions, and I'm not sure what page that is, but she mentions that once Esther is received by the king, she goes into him and he holds out his scepter and she is received by him, a story we'll talk about in a minute, that he scoops her up in his arms and carries her in. And it's a loving and dramatic and romantic gesture. That's not what you see in the Word of God. It's an addition. And that is what man tends to do anytime we have a great story. It's just embellishment. You don't even sometimes mean to embellish a story, but that's just how things kind of get. That's how they grow, right? So it's a beautiful effort that the Jews actually read this story of Esther from the Bible, right? It enables no embellishment. It needs no embellishment. Such a great story, but it also cuts out any opportunity to embellish. So I love that. And I love that the way it's written is so readable, like a play, a very dramatic play, by the way. So some people have thought, since there's no mention of God in the entire book of Esther, or this entire story, that it really shouldn't be included in scripture, in Holy Scripture, but most people agree that it should be included. And God is, again, throughout this entire book. An interesting thing about the story of Esther is that it's centered around banquets. It begins with a banquet. And of course, Esther's plea is all about banquets as well. And then for thousands of years, the faithful Jews have celebrated the Feast of Purim with a banquet. So just think that's very interesting. The beginning of our story starts with a 6-month-long feast. 6 months, 180 days. So maybe not exactly 6 months, but a very, very long celebration, which I don't understand. If it's a 6-month-long celebration and it's over after 6 months, do you then start it 6 months later to have the same celebration? I don't know. Anyway, this is what they did when they weren't at war, which Xerxes or Ahasuerus, same guy, same king, was often at war. Our author describes him, I hate looking this up because I never can quite find. Okay, so on page 142, she says that the king ruled the largest empire of the then known world, that he reigned 20 years. And she describes him as volatile and impulsive. And she's got a little bit that is quoted about him. I'm not going to read 142 and 143, but his acts were well known, and he was very, very violent. And murdering people was just part of his day. It just depended what kind of mood you found him in, which is really significant and going to be very important later when Esther has a request of the king. what kind of mood am I going to find this volatile, violent, impulsive king in? And I have a very important request. So that paints a bigger picture of the danger in our story. So we start our story with King Ahasuerus. I'm not sure what your version says, but mine, I'll probably call him Ahasuerus. And there is in chapter 1, and it's described the beautiful curtains and the decor in the temple, and just how everything was laid out so beautifully and so perfectly for this great banquet, and then this last special feast of the last 7 days. It made me think of, we just had a shower for Amanda Tillman at our house, and it was an awesome time. I mean, a lot of people came, a lot of people ate a lot of food, and Alexa and Jana had spent time decorating, I think, at least 4 sections of the house. They just draped it with beautiful things and balloons, and it was gorgeous. But man, it took forever. It took planning, and it took preparation and purchasing, and then putting everything up, not to mention taking everything down.
Yeah.
It's an event worth doing. I would do it again, but it's an event. So imagine this gigantic 6-month-long banquet, and especially ending it with that bang, that 7-day special feast. And the king, who has been partying for 6 months, eating and drinking and surrounded by his friends, probably a sense of mania in the air because you're all together and it's exciting, now wants to see his queen. Now, his queen, if you look in chapter 1 and verse 9, she was also giving a banquet for the women in the palace. So she was doing her own thing at the same time as the king doing his thing. And I think our author, or maybe another book I read, had said that they would not have normally banqueted together. So verse 10, on the 7th day, when the heart of the king was merry with wine, he commanded Mehuman, Biztha, Harbona, Bigtha, Abagtha, Zethar, and Carcass, probably didn't pronounce any of those right, the 7 eunuchs who served in the presence of King Ahasuerus. He commanded them to bring Queen Vashti before the king with her royal crown in order to display her beauty to the people and the princes, for she was beautiful. Now, some people will embellish this and say he wanted her to appear naked with her crown. He wanted her to appear seductive in her crown. But whatever the case, he is drunk. His heart is merry with wine, and he wants his queen in some way paraded in front of all of his friends, because she's very beautiful. But in verse 12, she refuses to do it. She refused to come at the king's command delivered by the eunuchs, which honestly, if she's been putting a banquet on for 6 months, she might have been a little busy, but she refused to do it. Then the king became very angry and his wrath burned within him. So here we come to a part, a personality trait of the king that is significant, and that is he takes a poll of all the people around him when he has a problem. So I think this is very significant about our king. He is volatile, he is impulsive, he is violent, he has all the power of the whole world in his hands, and he surrounds himself with people that he looks to for advice. Look at verse 13 of chapter 1 of Esther. The king is angry. We know that from verse 12 and 13. Then the king said to the wise men who understood the times, for it was the custom of the king, so to speak, before all who knew law and justice and were close to him. And then it names a whole bunch of them, including 7 princes of Persia and Media who had access to the king's presence and sat in the first place in the kingdom. These are people all around him that he surrounded himself. And he says, according to the law, what is to be done with Queen Vashti because she did not obey the command of King Ahasuerus delivered by the eunuchs? In the presence of the king and the princes, Memucan said, Queen Vashti has wronged not only the king, but also all the princes and all the peoples who are in the provinces of King Ahasuerus. For the queen's conduct will become known to all the women, causing them to look with contempt on their husbands by saying, King Ahasuerus commanded Queen Vashti to be brought into his presence, but she did not come. Verse 18, this day the ladies of Persia and Media who have heard of the queen's conduct will speak in the same way to all the king's princes, and there will be plenty of contempt and anger. So the very first thing they said is, well, this is bigger than you and your wife. This is bigger. She has defied the king. First of all, she's not allowed to defy the king, but even beyond that, all of the women are going to hear about this, and it will empower them to also not do what their husbands want them to do. And they're right about this. They're very right about this. You know, you have a leader, maybe it's a leader in the schools, maybe it's a leader in church, maybe it's a leader in your country, and they act a certain way. And it does affect everyone who sees it. So they're right about that. So verse 19, if it pleases the king, let a royal edict be issued by him, and let it be written in the laws of Persia and Media, so that it cannot be repealed, that Vashti may no longer come into the presence of King Ahasuerus, and let the king give her royal position to another who is more worthy than she. Now, they did not recommend that he murder her, but they could have, and he could have. He was known for being really aggressive and volatile, remember? And so he could have had her killed. He did not value human life. Verse 20, when the king's edict, which he will make, is heard throughout all the kingdom, great as it is, then all women will give honor to their husbands, great and small. So basically they say, you need to make an example of her, king. You need to make it clear that this action is not acceptable. And they're also right about that. You know, I'm not judging whether or not it was right for him to call her, whether it was right for her to refuse. I'm simply talking about the influence that people have over other people. The disobedience, the flippancy with the king, the refusal to do what he's asked her to do will be known. And how the king reacts to it will also be known. And how the king reacts to how the king handles her after this will also be known. So they're right about this. Verse 21, this word pleased the king and the princes, and the king did as Memucan proposed. So he sent letters to all the king's provinces, to each province according to its script, and to every people according to their language, that every man should be the master in his own house and the one who speaks in the language of his own people. So we definitely don't want those women to get the idea that it is a-okay to not listen to their husbands. And just to, for that reason, he's going to discipline his wife, throw her out of the palace. But also, he's going to send a letter to be read throughout the provinces that this was not okay. This is not okay. We're not upending the established authority here. So I did not mean to read most of chapter 1. Kim, I'm wanting you to do more of my reading if you're okay with that. I cannot replace you as my reader, but let's, are there any responses to chapter 1 here of Esther? Let me look over my notes while did you think it was reasonable for the king to want to see his queen, or was it unreasonable? What's your thought on that? Because I don't actually know. I don't know. I mean, I do know that he was drunk.
Yeah.
That seems unpleasant and horrible to me, but I don't live a life where we have 6-month banquets. I don't know if that was a normal thing. We don't, it does. Go ahead, Fiona.
I think it would have been okay to ask her to come out as his wife, but not to parade her as a possession and not knowing for sure how she was supposed to be attired. That's another thing. So I think there's circumstances. I mean, you're supposed to honor your wife, and if he did it with honor, yes, but if he did it with dishonor to just show her off, this is another little tool I've got or another little jewel I've got.
Mhm.
And that's kind of how he's doing it. It's like, well, she didn't do what I want, so let's just get rid of her and move on to the next one.
Mhm.
That's the part I don't like. I mean, of course, that was the Old Testament. You could replace a woman just as quick because you didn't like the way she fixed your breakfast.
Mhm.
So uh, I, I think if it would have been a respectful manner, yes. Disrespectful manner, no.
Well, these are not Jews, take
Right.
note of that, which obviously but yeah, so verse 11 of chapter 1 said that his intent was to display her beauty to the people and the princes because she was so beautiful. So that we know his intent, but we don't know necessarily why in verse 12 she decided not to come. Maybe
Yeah.
she was hesitant to come. Like I said, I mean, I'm being silly here, but she might have been otherwise entangled. She might have been busy. There was a lot that was going on. So we don't know why she refused. We don't know if she was offended. And, we really can't read into that. But
Right.
the facts are he wanted this. She did not give him what he wanted. And his advisor said, oh, this is dangerous, right? What is that term I keep hearing? It's a slippery slope.
Yeah.
Which, I mean, you really shouldn't determine what exactly is you're going to do in your life by what is determined to be a slippery slope. I would say that that's a tactic, that's a scare tactic in people's lives. However, they're telling him this is bad. This could change everything. They're basically saying this could change all of the culture of our land. And they're again, I believe they're not wrong about that. So um then we don't have to go through chapter 2 necessarily, but we see in chapter 2 that they have like what some people have called a beauty contest, where they primp and they prepare themselves for a year. Our author really goes through that, and she's like, honestly, a year in a spa, how amazing would that be? Um, you know, I um, I just think everything about me changes when I use lotion one time. I just think, wow, that was nice. I should do that more. But imagine just obsessing over your physical body in such a way that you are, your whole goal. It makes me think of like TV stars and movie stars. Part of their job is to maintain their physical body in such a way that they can appear on TV. Obviously that's not the life of a Christian, because that shouldn't be our obsession, but that is part of what they have in on their plate in their job description. But for these women, that was their job as well. So what happens? The king's attendants in verse 2 tell him, let beautiful young virgins be sought for the king. So send out the word that all beautiful young virgins are to come to the palace and prepare themselves for the king. So this is a king who likes beauty. Let's just, focus on that particular part of a woman. Hold on, let me look at my notes really quickly. Okay, so they have this beauty contest in chapter 2, and I don't mean to belittle it by calling it that, but that this is about how they look. And if you look in verse 8, let me see. Kim, would you mind reading for me?
Okay.
Hold on one second. So the decree is in verses 1 through 4, really. And then I would really like you to read 5 through 11, if you don't mind, of chapter 2.
Okay. In Shushan the Sentinel, there was a certain Jew whose name was Mordecai, the son of Jair, the son of Shimei, the son of Kish, a Benjamite. Kish had been carried away from Jerusalem with the captives who had been captured with Jeconiah, king of Judah, whom Nebuchadnezzar, the king of Babylon, had carried away. And Mordecai had been brought up Hadassah, that is Esther, his uncle's daughter, for she had neither father nor mother. The young woman was lovely and beautiful. When her father and mother died, Mordecai took her as his own daughter. Through what verse?
All the way through verse 11.
Okay. So it was when the king's command and decree were heard, and when many young women were gathered at Sushan the Sentinel under the custody of Hegai, that Esther also was taken to the king's palace into the care of Hegai, the custodian of the women. Now the young woman pleased him, and she obtained his favor. So he readily gave beauty preparations to her, besides her allowance. The 7 chose maidservants were provided for her from the king's palace, and he moved her and her maidservants to the best place in the house of the women. Esther had not revealed her people or family, for Mordecai had charged her not to reveal it. And every day Mordecai paced in front of the court of the women's quarters to learn of Esther's welfare and what was happening to her.
Thank you. So we meet Mordecai, who is very invested in this process. Now, whether he has any inkling of how important it's going to be at this point, we don't know. Or maybe he is just taking his responsibility of being the guardian of Esther very seriously. She's been taken into this harem, she's been taken in as what our author says, a captive. Clearly, it doesn't seem like these women had any choice. But he is concerned, and he's every day walking back and forth trying to find out if she's doing okay. So he is very, very invested in this process. He's also raised her to be discreet about her heritage. I don't know if there were other girls of Jewish descent, other Hebrews, as they called them, or other Jews within this beauty contest. We're not told. She might have been the only one.
Yeah.
But Mordecai did not want her to reveal that difference to anyone around her. And that might have just been him being very shrewd and very careful. From verses 12 to verses 14, we find out it sure seems like the women go in and spend a night with the king, and they take their turns spending a night with the king. It makes me think of that show called The Bachelor, something I do not recommend you watch, but a bunch of women are presented to one man or one woman, and they get to choose one. And when he has a night with the woman, and we're not told that they sleep together, we're not told that. So I don't think that we can necessarily assume that. But she leaves in the morning, and the king decides if he liked her or not. And she's given a lot. Like she's given, it says in verse 13, she can take with her from the harem. Anything that she desired was given to her to take with her from the harem to the king's palace. So go ahead, Nancy.
Jennifer,
Uh-huh.
my Bible in verse 14 says, in the evening she went, and on the morrow she returned into the second house of the women to the custody of Sejgaz, the king's chamberlain, which kept the concubines. Now, do we know that concubines means women that the men sleep with, or is that just a regular term during that?
I think it's understood that they were having sex with whoever they belong to.
Okay.
They are at his disposal, let's just say it that way.
Yeah,
So,
that's what I thought.
Technically, I think you can say she was a virgin for a year. She was pampered and loved, physically worried about her body and got herself, perfect and pristine. And she had one night with the king. She either became the queen or she became a concubine. So, it does definitely seem like she has sex with the king. And then once she is not chosen to be the queen, then she continues to stay in the service of the king as his concubine. So I think that's a very good point, Nancy. Let's see. And then Kim, will you read for us verses 15 and 16? 15 through 18, if you will.
Now, when the turn came for Esther, the daughter of Abihail, the uncle of Mordecai, who had taken her as his daughter, to go into the king, she requested nothing but that Hegai, the king's eunuch, the custodian of the women, advised. And Esther obtained favor in the sight of all who saw her. So Esther was taken to the king Ahasuerus into his royal palace in the 10th month, which is the month of Tebeth, in the 7th year of his reign. The king loved Esther more than all the other women, and she obtained grace and favor in his sight more than all the virgins. So he set the royal crown upon her head and made her queen instead of Vashti. Then the king made a great feast, the feast of Esther, for all his officials and servants, and he proclaimed a holiday in the provinces and gave gifts according to the generosity of a king.
Thank you. So we now have banquet number 2 that's mentioned, and this one is Esther's banquet. In honor of the fact that the king has replaced the queen, our author says it's been 4 years since Vashti was expelled from the palace. The king's been busy in that time and did not miss the queen until it starts in chapter 2 of verse 1. It says that his anger has subsided and he remembers Vashti. So he's longing for another queen. And then a year passes because these women were being taken care of and pampered. And then now he has another queen, Queen Esther, and he is generously giving gifts. Mine says at the end, he gave gifts according to the king's bounty. So he's just, this is a great big celebration. Let me see if there's anything. Does anybody have any comments about that while I'm looking at my notes? Interesting that it says the king loved Esther more than all the women. That's interesting. This isn't actually a story about love. This is a story about being pressed into service and being a voluntold, right? Not a volunteer. So also, I also think this is interesting, not necessarily notable, but the women were taught, I'm assuming, all sorts of beauty regimens and all sorts of tricks of the beauty trade and learning how to do different things, I would guess, with their hair and with their skin. And they are permitted to take anything from that experience in with them for the one night that they have with the king. Esther chose not to do any of those things. It's notable only because it's within the story of Esther, but it is within that story. So she didn't pull any tricks on him. She didn't do anything but bring her own natural self in, and she was loved by him and desired by him. I hope they talked. I hope they had a conversation and were able to get to know each other a little bit in that one night. I don't know if that's a thing, and if she, engaged him with her ability to talk with him. We're not actually told anything about that. We're not even told that they were told how to talk to the king or how to address him or, thought of things to talk with him about. We're not even told about that. But at any rate, she found favor and kindness with him. Do you see that in verse 17? Favor and kindness. That is not a word I would use to describe this king. Not only historically, he was brutal and volatile and violent, but she's found a soft place in him, which is a very beautiful thing to say. I would hope that all women everywhere could inspire that in their husbands. So let me see. Then we have just a blip in verses 21 to 23 about how Mordecai, who it says that he was sitting at the king's gate. And I'm grateful that our author, I believe it's our author who mentions that he had a job. It sounds like a gatekeeper job, which is a very important job. If you are the gatekeeper for the king, you determine who goes before him, what their manner of business is, and if they're allowed to see him and how long they're allowed to see him. So Mordecai had an official position, even though in Esther right here, it just says that he was sitting at the king's gate. But he hears while he's sitting at the king's gate that there are people who want to kill the king. And he tells Queen Esther in verse 22, and Esther informed the king in Mordecai's name. They investigated this plot. They found it to be true. And both of those people were hanged on the gallows. And then notably, it was written in the book of the Chronicles in the king's presence. So this was written out because it was a very important event. It was an assassination plot. And Mordecai was able to use his connection to Esther to overthrow that. So we move along to Haman. And Haman is one of these people that the king values. Haman sounds like he's as ruthless as the king. And it says that the king values him so much that he promotes him and gave him authority over all the princes who were with him. So this is the second in command. This is the king, and then Haman has authority over everybody else. And one thing that they were supposed to do for Haman was, because he was second in command, everyone there, when he passed by, they were supposed to bow down to him. That is such a trip. That's such a power trip. Walk along the street and have everybody bow to you, right? And of course, in verse 2 of chapter 3, all the king's servants who were at the king's gate bowed down and paid homage to Haman, for so the king had commanded concerning him. But Mordecai neither bowed down nor paid homage. So he was not going to pay homage means to remember them and to worship them. And he was not about to worship Haman. I don't know what he did with the king. I don't know if he chose to bow to the king. I would assume that he did with the job he had, but he was not going to do that to Haman. One reason why he might bow to the king is because he believed that God puts kings in authority, right? That it's up to God who is in authority. And it's clear from this story that Mordecai believes God is in control. But at the same time, God didn't put Haman in authority from what Mordecai sees. It was the king that did that. So he does not get Mordecai's humility and worship for him. When he's asked about it in verse 3, the king's servants at the gate said to Mordecai, "Why are you transgressing the king's command?" We do not have an answer to that. We're not told exactly why. And they went and tattled on him to Haman. Now, Haman, I think, would have noticed this in time, but just in case he didn't, he had people come and tell them about Mordecai. In verse 5, when Haman saw that Mordecai neither bowed down nor paid homage to him, Haman was filled with rage. So a lot of things in this story of Esther are very extreme, and this is one of them. Haman is just filled with rage. When somebody is filled with rage, sometimes it lasts for a while, and they look for things that are wrong with you. They make up things that they want to be wrong with you. They don't listen to any sort of reason about you. And Haman was filled with rage. So let's see. So in verse 6, my version says he disdained to lay hands on Mordecai alone. Some of your versions might say he was afraid, or he was not wanting to lay hands on Mordecai. And the reason is that he found out what he was. He found out he was a Jew. Let me read verse 6 really quickly. But he disdained to lay hands on Mordecai alone, for they had told him who the people of Mordecai were. Therefore, Haman sought to destroy all the Jews, the people of Mordecai, who were throughout the whole kingdom of Ahasuerus. So for some reason, Haman feared taking out a Jew. Maybe he feared the rest of the Jews, a retaliation, something like that. And he's just decided he is going to use his power and influence and obliterate all of the Jews. It's anti-Semitism. It's just I don't like these people and I want them gone. And that's the beginning of, we had heard Mordecai tell Esther, don't divulge who you are. Let's see the wording of that exactly. Let's see. So it was in chapter 2, verse 10. Esther did not make her people or her kindred, make known her people or her kindred, for Mordecai had instructed her that she should not make them known. So we hear about her people, her kindred. Now we hear about Mordecai. He is a Jew, and Haman wants to kill all of the Jews because of it. So you begin to see this people within a people, so to speak. They're enmeshed. Mordecai has a job with the king. Esther is queen, but they're enmeshed, so they're within the society, but they are also separate. They consider themselves separate. It might be because of their Jewish laws, and they're following those while living in exile in this other place. But they're very distinctive, which I think is, of course, a lesson to Christians today, to be very distinctive among all of the other people. If you look at, let's see, we're still in chapter 3. If you look at verse 8, you'll see what Haman does. Now, Haman is very close to the king and knows that the king is impressionable. I don't know if I've used that word yet to describe him. I've said volatile and violent and impulsive. He is impressionable. And we're going to see that. We saw it initially when they said it was customary for him to gather all the people and say, what's the law on this Vashti thing? What do I have to do? And he takes the advice of someone around him. But Haman knows this about him. And it's a good thing that King Ahasuerus is impressionable, because later Esther makes an impression on him. Esther tells him things, and he is able to be swayed in her direction. So that's a good thing about this king. It's a good quality when the outcome is good. Let's just say that. So chapter 3, verse 8, then Haman said to King Ahasuerus, there is a certain people scattered and dispersed among the peoples in all the provinces of your kingdom. Their laws are different from those of all other people, and they do not observe the king's laws. So it is not in the king's interest to let them remain. If it is pleasing to the king, let it be decreed that they be destroyed. And I will pay 10,000 talents of silver into the hands of those who carry on the king's business to put into the king's treasuries. So Haman decides to embellish the story because there's no evidence that the Jews are not following the king's laws. There's no evidence of that. Otherwise, it would be known. There are enough people looking out for the king that it would be known. Look at the one thing that we're told about Mordecai. He didn't bow before Haman, and he got ratted out. They tattled on him for this. Went right to the king, right to Haman, and now, of course, it's going to the king. But he says they have their own laws, which they did. They had dietary and laws of how to treat people. But he says they do not observe the king's laws. I think it was more likely that they were doing both. And, Haman says, this is not going to serve you well to keep them here. I don't know how long they were there. But suddenly, Haman has a problem. And so he is. Have you ever dealt with somebody who wanted something, and so they paint everything in a slanted way so that you'll be convinced of what they want? That's exactly what Haman is doing here. And Haman doesn't just say, this is bad, we need to watch these people. He says, I think you should make a decree that they all be killed. Verse 9, just kill them all. Because Haman has no use for people who are not going to be lifting him up in his life. And also the king has been known to be very, very vicious. And so in verse 10, because the king trusts Haman so much, the king took his signet ring from his hand and gave it to Haman, the son of Hamadatha the Agagite, the enemy of the Jews. So now we have a little title there, Haman, comma, the enemy of the Jews. The king said to Haman, the silver is yours, and the people also, to do with them as you please. He's not really, it seems kind of flippant, doesn't it? I don't need your money, and here's my ring. You go ahead and take care of whatever it is. Notice that we're not even told how many people this involves. He doesn't say, and king, I mean, of all the thousands under your rule, this is, a couple hundred, or maybe 1,000, or maybe, we're talking about 2% of our population. You won't even feel a thing. We're not even told about that. We're just told Haman has this problem. Haman goes to the king. He slants it in such a way that the king is like, okay, I'm for that. Takes off his ring, says, do with it what you will. And by taking off his ring, he was giving Haman authority, more authority than he already had. Let's see. And then this plot of Haman is written down. The king's scribes write it down. And then in chapter 4, Esther hears of Haman's plot. It's known. It's known through the palace, and it's going to be known everywhere. Let's see. So in chapter 4, it's a pretty big chapter because Esther learns about it, but only after Mordecai had heard about it. So in verse 1, Kim, will you be ready to read again?
Sure.
Could you read for me verses 1 through 8?
Okay. When Mordecai learned all that had happened, he tore his clothes and put on sackcloth and ashes and went out into the midst of the city. He cried out with a loud and bitter cry. He went as far as the front of the king's gate, for no one might enter the king's gate clothed with sackcloth. And in every province where the king's command and decree arrived, there was great mourning among the Jews, with fasting, weeping, and wailing, and many lay in sackcloth and ashes. So Esther's maids and eunuchs came and told her, and the queen was deeply distressed. Then she sent garments to clothe Mordecai and take his sackcloth away from him, but he would not accept them. Then Esther called Hakath, one of the king's eunuchs, whom he had appointed to attend her, and she gave him a command concerning Mordecai to learn what and why this was. So Hakath went out to Mordecai in the city square that was in front of the king's gate. And Mordecai told him all that had happened to him and the sum of money that Haman had promised to pay to the king's treasuries to destroy the Jews. He also gave him a copy of the written decree for their destruction, which was given to Shushan, that he might show it to Esther and explain it to her, and that he might command her to go into the king to make supplication to him and plead before him for her people.
Thank you. So Mordecai goes out in a very dramatic fashion. I mean, it's a dramatic thing that's happened, right? They're going to be annihilated. It's allowed, and within a year, they're going to all be killed. And he goes out in a very dramatic fashion, very loudly, weeping, wailing. He is dressed in sackcloth. He is calling a lot of attention to himself. And the funny thing about Mordecai, he doesn't seem to mind calling attention to himself. He doesn't seem to. And Esther has her maidens and her eunuchs. They come and tell her, and she is, my version says, writhing in great anguish. Something's wrong with Mordecai, and it really bothers Esther. And so she sends him clothes to take off the sackcloth, and she tries to cheer him up, I guess. But of course it doesn't work, because clothes are not going to fix this problem. And Mordecai then gives all the information of what he knows about Haman's plot. Esther hears about it, and because he actually has a copy of the edict, so he's got official documents. And she replies to Mordecai in this verse 11, all the king's servants And the people of the king's provinces know that for any man or woman who comes to the king, to the inner court, who's not summoned, he has but one law, that he be put to death, unless the king holds out to him the golden scepter so that he may live. And I have not been summoned to come to the king for these 30 days. So she says, I'm not really there. I don't have contact with the king. It's dangerous for me to go. I don't think he wants to see me. He hasn't summoned me for more than 30 days. And then Mordecai answers her back and he says, well, he tells him to reply, do not imagine that you in the king's palace can escape any more than all the Jews. He's like, don't forget, you also are a Jew. You're not going to lie about it. People know you. You're going to be outed as a Jew, and your life is as important as the rest of ours. Just because you're there with the king doesn't mean it's going to be okay for you to live. Verse 14, for if you remain silent at this time, relief and deliverance will arise for the Jews from another place, and you and your father's house will perish. And who knows whether you have not attained royalty for such a time as this. And these are awesome words because they show Mordecai's heart. They show that he has faith, that, what does he say? Relief and deliverance will arise for the Jews from another place. Doesn't have to be you, Esther. Doesn't have to be you, but you're in a position where you can help. And then he says, who knows? Maybe that's exactly why you're in this position. You're not the only beautiful girl out of all those beautiful virgins, but you were chosen by the king. And so those two statements are really, really impactful. I think I'm breaking up a little.
Yeah.
Did you hear any of that? I don't even know.
Yeah.
Okay. So if it's doing to you what it's doing to me is it kind of catches up. So anyway, these are two incredible statements. Number one, he doesn't say God because God's not mentioned in this book, but God will deliver the Jews. He's going to deliver his people. And it may or may not be through you. If it's not through you, God will find another way. Really significant teaching. And then the second thing is, but this could be the exact reason that you're in this position. I just think there's a lot to be learned from both of those scriptures. Just in your everyday and my everyday. So one of the key ideas in the story of Esther is that God is at work even when he's behind the scenes. And he's behind the scenes, he's not in the story. But these are the people of God. The Jews know God, and God is at work. Mordecai has this incredible faith. He's just not worried about his everyday walk, his everyday decision making. Now listen, he was in sackcloth and he was wailing, but I think he did that to get attention. And he did get Esther's attention. Because he clearly says God's going to deliver the Jews. He, as a people, will keep his people alive. Let's see. And so here is actually, we're almost at the end of the hour, which I won't keep you much longer than 11, but here we actually come to the whole point of why this is in our book. And that is Esther has a very important job. She's got to go talk to the king, and she knows it. And what she tells her people to do is very, very significant. So Kim, you want to read 15 through 17 for me of chapter 4?
Okay. Let me get down there. Okay, then Esther told reply, drink for 3 days, night or day. My maids and I will fast likewise. And so I will go to the king, which is against the law. And if I perish, I perish. So Mordecai went his way, did according to all that Esther commanded him.
Okay, so she devises a plan. We know that she's pretty smart about the things she plans, and we don't find that she's relying on anyone around her to help her make this plan, unlike the king, right, who sort of takes a poll of everybody around him. She tells him, assemble all the Jews who are in Susa, all of the Jews who are here, our people, our community, and fast for me. Do not eat or drink for 3 days. So don't just not eat. Don't just give up one item, but actually don't eat anything, don't drink anything for 3 days. And I and my maidens will also fast in the same way. So we are all going to fast and we are going to pray. Let's see, the prayer is assumed with the fasting. She says, and thus I will go into the king, which is not according to the law. I'm going to break the law and go see the king. And if I die, I die. And so Esther plans a banquet. We can kind of scoot through this. In the middle of her first banquet, she also plans a second banquet, but in between the two of them, the king can't sleep. So he starts to read the chronicles of his life. And in the book of the King's Chronicles, not our book of Chronicles, but the book of the King's Chronicles, he reads about Mordecai and how Mordecai saved his life. And he wants to honor Mordecai. And what's real funny about this, and there's whole other lessons about who Haman is and his pride and whatnot, but he keeps kind of stubbing his toe on Mordecai. You know, anytime he's around him, Mordecai refuses to bow down to him, and it just infuriates him. But he has a plan. He's going to kill him and all his people, all his family. So I guess he just sort of lives with that plan. If you look at chapter 5 and verse 9, Haman is so proud of himself because he's been invited to this banquet with Esther. It says, then Haman went out that day glad and pleased of heart. But when Haman saw Mordecai in the king's gate, and that he did not stand up or tremble before him, Haman was filled with anger against Mordecai. But verse 10, it says, he controlled himself and went to his house. So he's, you know, he has a plan. He's going to get rid of this, the bane of his existence, Mordecai, who will not bow down to him. So we know, many of you know the story, but Esther goes into the king and he is kind to her. He does lift his scepter to her, and he does allow her to talk to him, and she invites him to the banquet. And later, after a few banquets, she has the time to talk to him. And we're not going to actually go through all of the story, but the Jews are able to fight back, and they are not annihilated. They don't just have to lay down and take it. They actually have the ability to fight back. But I think we should focus on Esther's reliance on God's people praying for her, right? As soon as she found out she had to do this job, she had to go into the king, that her life was going to be in jeopardy because of this, she had all of God's people pray on her behalf, fast and pray. And she had all of her maids who would not have been God's people also fasting. And as a leader, you've got to rely on prayer. You know, it's funny because we pray for our leaders. We pray for church leaders. We pray for the leaders of our country. But Esther was praying as a leader. Our leaders should be praying for themselves. You know, it reminds me of Solomon when he used to be king in place of his father David, and he tells God, I'm like a little kid. I just don't even hardly know what I'm doing. And he, of course, sought wisdom from God. But that's what the attitude should be of all leaders, not taking a poll of the room, but talking to God about it. So you've got that, Esther relying on God and his strength versus the king who is relying on himself and on everybody else. And remember, the fact that this king is impressionable is actually a good thing, because he listened to Esther. He wasn't hardened against Esther. So I told you one of the key ideas in the story of Esther is that God is at work even when he's behind the scenes. A second key idea is that the schemes of the wicked are doomed, which is something that's all throughout the book of Proverbs. The schemes of the wicked are doomed. And number three, God's plan for his people cannot be thwarted. When Mordecai said, if you don't do this, then the Jews will be rescued in another way. God will find a way to rescue his people, but maybe you're the person that he wants to use. It was clear that he was saying, God is going to rescue his people, and you're tripping up and you're not doing your part is not going to keep that from happening. That's a pretty great message in the story of Esther. And then another list that I have is lessons to learn from Esther. Number one, surround yourself with good advisors. Mordecai was Esther's advisor, and he had the interest of God and God's people. Number two is pray to God for wisdom and guidance. Of course, that is an incredible lesson in the story of Esther. And number three is pretty significant. And actually, the man who preached for us last Sunday night brought this up. Hubert Smith had talked about death. But number three is understand that death is not the worst thing that could happen to you. Easy to say, harder to live that way. But if you turn in your New Testament to Matthew chapter 10, this is the thinking that Mordecai possessed and also that Esther possessed after she seemed a little bit anxious at first about going into the king and talking to the king. She seemed to have this same attitude that Jesus teaches in Matthew 10 and verse 28. Jesus says, do not fear those who kill the body, but are unable to kill the soul, but rather fear him who is able to destroy both soul and body in hell. And where some people really read the last part of that verse and it's scary to them because all powerful Almighty God has that ability. The first part of that verse can change your life. These people around you can kill your body, but you're an eternal soul. And there's more to life on this earth than whether or not you, or how you die necessarily. And if you live your life in fear of dying, you won't do the things that you need to do. I think that's a great lesson learned from Esther. And finally, let's see. I was trying to see what our author's notes about this were. It's funny, on page 150, she actually addresses Esther. Esther, I look forward to meeting you and talking with you. She's talking about later because, of course, she wants to meet Esther in heaven. Does anybody have any comments so far? Because we're almost through. I've gone over a little too long, but I know we didn't get through the whole story of Esther. It's only 10 chapters and it's an awesome read if you have the time to just really sit and read it. But I guarantee you're going to come out with a whole lot more lessons than what I plucked out of there today, because it's just an incredible book. But I mostly wanted to focus on Esther's reliance on God in this very difficult mission that she had. And I did want to mention that there are two major themes in the book of Esther. One is Purim, which is, like I said, casting lots. It actually became the Feast of Purim where they read the story. Because when we think of casting lots, we think of like gambling, but they believed that God was the caster of the lot, that God, the way that God wanted it to be was the way it was going to be. And also the theme of the people of God. Notice how the Jews were very distinctive in the story. That's also part of the theme of the book of Esther, or the story of Esther, the salvation of the Jews. And remember, there's so many, at this point in time in history, when Esther, the story of Esther occurred, they had the miraculous rescuing from Egypt, the Jews had. They had the miraculous falling of the walls at Jericho. They had the miraculous parting of the sea. This one doesn't seem miraculous on its face, does it? It almost seems coincidental. And there was this plot to kill the Jews, but there was a Jew who was in the palace, and she went and talked to the king. And unless you have this point of view that Mordecai gives you, you could easily say, wow, gee, that just worked out so well, and almost as if it was by chance, which is why the whole story is, they call it Purim, the casting of lots, like by chance. But you see Mordecai's perspective, and none of it was by chance, even though God's not mentioned in the book. It's very, very cool story for sure. Anybody have anything to add? I apologize, I'm keeping you over a little bit. No? Okay. Well, I love you all. Very happy to see you. Just so you know, I don't know that I'm going to be doing the Thursday night Old Testament this week because I have a wedding rehearsal I've got to run. So I'm not going to be able to actually do that this week.
Okay.
But we'll talk to you all later.
Thank you, Jennifer.
Bye, everybody.
Bye, everybody. Nice to see you.